Welcome to episode 123 of the G2 on 5G. It's the latest insight scoop on everything 5G. We cover 6 topics in about 20 minutes, and it's brought to you by More Insights and Strategy. I'm Will Townsend, and joining me again this week is fellow analyst Anshel Sag. Let's get started with my first topic, and you and I were just talking. It's earnings week, so I'm going to highlight and recap T-Mobile's 3Q earnings, and they're quite impressive. I did share a little insight on Twitter earlier today. But what really struck me was a statistic that they quoted. So in the recent quarter, they had 1.6 million postpaid net customer adds. That's actually more than AT&T and Verizon combined. And they stated it's an increase of 368,000 year over year. So very impressive. Revenue, small growth, but still moving in the right direction. They reported that T-Mobile for Business reported one of its highest postpaid phone net add quarters and added more business accounts than Verizon did. So I don't know where they're anchoring that statistic. For our viewers and listeners, you and I and Patrick Moorhead just collaborated on a Forbes article that was posted yesterday. And we encourage, if you hit either one of our Twitter feeds, you'll find a link to that. But we sort of talked about T-Mobile for Business and the forward, looking momentum and some of our insights there. But all in all, Team Magenta continues to deliver.
Yeah, I think I got a little bit of a preload on earnings, thankfully, but yeah, I mean, there's really not much here to not like.
Yeah.
Especially in when you consider how many of T-Mobile's competitors are not growing as quickly. And I think there are already economic headwinds in the last year or so with inflation. And I think a lot of people, based on the earnings calls I've heard today, lots of doom and gloom in terms of outlook for the rest of the year and next year. Meanwhile, T-Mobile pretty much seems impervious to it. So I think at this point we're really looking at a strong T-Mobile that positioned itself for this kind of growth with the merger with Sprint. And if you look at the earnings, they actually guided another $200 million of extra synergies that they're going to be able to realize through the merger, which means that's another $200 million of profitability that they're going to be able to eke out as a result of this merger. So I think we're going to see a lot more growth from T-Mobile on the business side after our conversation with T-Mobile for Business, but also just like, their network, they said they now cover over 250 million people with their mid-band network, which means that they are getting ever closer to that full 300 million pop. And I think that's going to be, that last 50 million is going to be very challenging for anybody. And I think 250 million is already quite a challenge. I think Verizon and AT&T are going to take some time to get to that point as well. So, I think that standalone network and the new applications that will come from it will really increase the opportunities for T-Mobile to eke out additional profitability from a network that's already fairly mature.
Yeah, no, I agree. And, we've talked about the full promise of 5G being delivered through standalone. And I expect that that will only enhance what T-Mobile for Business is working on. But again, it's a pretty lengthy article, but there's lots of nuggets in there. So we encourage our viewers and listeners to go find that on either Anchel's feed or my feed. But let's move to your first topic this week. And I saw a little bit of this as well. You want to talk about Huawei's earnings and some recent DOJ charges against the Chinese infrastructure provider.
So yeah, the clarification, they announced earnings, and actually earnings were better than expected. Basically, their earnings for the first 9 months of this year declined 2.2% from last year, which isn't a huge decline when you look at other declines that are happening. In fact, if you look at the Chinese smartphone market, based on Canalys research, their data says the Chinese market shrunk 11% this quarter. So the fact that they only declined 2.2% compared to last year is actually a win, I think.
Yeah.
And also they said that they were actually their profit margin for the first 9 months of the year was 6.1%, which is a decline from the previous year, but they're actually able to show third quarter revenue rising 6.5%. So they're
Yeah.
actually having revenue starting to rebound a little bit. And
Mhm.
apparently that has to do with infrastructure, not necessarily devices. But I
Yeah.
was looking at Canalis's smartphone volume and market share in China, and it shows Huawei's market share is starting to rebound as well on smartphones. So it seems like the worst days for Huawei are behind them.
Mhm.
That said, um, it's unclear how they will be able to compete with their other Chinese competitors in China and abroad, especially on the smartphone side. But the other part of that story, which I think is a much bigger problem for Huawei within the U.S. and abroad, is that two Chinese intelligence officers were charged with obstructing the DOJ's prosecution, and they were trying to um, basically pay a U.S. government employee a total of $61,000 in Bitcoin for confidential information about the DOJ's pending prosecution of Huawei. So
Okay.
it does not look good for Huawei because that kind of um, invalidates the whole thing that Huawei is not connected to the Chinese government.
Right.
I don't necessarily see the U.S. Spy agencies like the CIA trying to do the same thing for, say, a Cisco or an Intel. Um, so, and industrial espionage and bribing, officials seems like a very contrary to what the Chinese government claims they are.
Yeah.
But in general, it's just not a really good look for Huawei or the Chinese government, and I think it just further, adds another nail to the Huawei coffin in a lot of countries.
Yeah, so they're going to have to look for their growth in their core Asian markets for sure, and this doesn't look good for them longer term, and it probably does, slam the door shut, a door that was probably already closed. But to your point, from an earnings perspective, it seems like they're stabilizing the bleeding a little bit there, and I didn't dive into it, but I suspect that some of that rebound might also be within or contributed to what they're doing within the enterprise networking space as well. So as they've had to sort of retrench their infrastructure business and to a certain extent their end device business, I think that's probably where they're seeing some pickup there. It's just sort of a hypothesis that I'll throw out there. But well, let's move to my second topic this week, and I want to talk about Dish and their claim that they're less than 30% of the U.S. population coverage with their 5G standalone network. And so we've talked about this in the past. So they were staring down um, at a very, very potentially big fine by not meeting their 20% coverage requirement. So um, this is interesting because they've only moved the coverage needle 5 percentage points since that time. And it was actually Sumeric wrote this article. What's happening, I think, is that Wall Street is getting a little bit nervous, and they're wondering, how well is Dish's, overall deployment going? I mean, it seems like everyone under the sun is involved with them. They're leaning into, Open RAN and disaggregation and cloudification to speed their greenfield network deployment. But it seems like things are still sort of off track. But would love to get your insights.
I think when you look at what's going on with Dish, um, I think it's a difficult situation because building a new network is always a challenge.
Oh yeah,
Um,
we saw that with Rakuten as well, right? So
right, there's growing
um,
pains.
yeah,
What's interesting is they are adding 1,000 towers per month,
I read
uh,
that. I thought
and
that
they
was
said that
interesting because that's a lot. I mean, if they're adding 1,000 towers a month, man, their coverage numbers should be moving a lot greater. Wouldn't you think?
yes, but I think a lot of those towers are probably also in places where they already have towers,
Yeah.
improving coverage. because you kind of want to build a network that's good in fewer places first, and you want to build a network that's bad everywhere. So that's kind of I think the thought process is you want to build a network that's dense enough that a user can actually use it in a way that's a good experience that you can keep that customer.
Yeah.
I think a good example of that is actually Sprint. I think they built a bad network in a lot of places,
Yeah.
and as a result, they lost a lot of customers, and they were hemorrhaging customers, near the end at an insane rate.
Right.
And I think that when you look at what they're trying to do, I think they should be given some more wiggle room, honestly.
Yeah.
But deadlines are deadlines, and I think they need to um, you know continue down this path. But I guess if they were able to beat their 25% requirement, um, they're gonna have to continue to move those the needle. And I think they may need some more investment.
Yeah.
I find that when these big capital expenditures exist, having capital to build capital um, is very important. And I feel like Dish could probably use some infusion, but I also feel like that some of that may come from the fact that the way Dish operates,
Yeah.
they don't necessarily want to have other investors partake in this. But I think that might be what's necessary to get growth to where it needs to be.
Yeah.
Um, we'll see.
Yeah, and then, we've talked about RAN sharing in Europe and on prior podcasts, and, I don't know if they could find someone else, to do that with, but, some operators in Europe, they're recognizing that, just to your point, the CapEx and the OpEx layout to do all this is quite massive. And so, yeah, I mean, Dish may have to get creative here to accelerate it, but it's, at the end of the day, moving the needle only 5% in coverage over a 4-month period doesn't really bode well. But we'll keep our eyes open and our ears open as well, and report back maybe on a future podcast there. But let me move. Let's move to your second topic. You want to talk about Starlink, and I did catch this news as well. They're considering capping user bandwidth, right?
Yeah, so this is a story from PC Mag. Basically, they went through the new service plan agreement, and it adds new language that incorporates a monthly allocation of priority access, which is
Yeah.
a very roundabout way of saying data cap.
Yeah.
Um, I think it's
Throttle,
very
throttle,
funny, actually.
throttle.
Well,
Yeah.
it's basically what Verizon and AT&T offer if you go over your data cap, right? They just
Yeah.
throttle you down to a
To
very
3G.
slow speed, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of what you're seeing here. I think this is something that many of us probably expected was inevitable with time, as their user base started to grow.
Yeah.
Realistically, I think satellite has a future. I just think that it will be great as a component carrier or as an emergency service layer.
Yeah.
Maybe not necessarily as a primary use case, but I do think there are a lot of people out there who can benefit from having, a technology like Starlink in places where there just isn't any service whatsoever.
Yeah.
And I'm not here to really cheer that Starlink has data caps, because I think data caps suck.
Yeah.
But I also think that, like, maybe Starlink is starting to come a little bit more towards reality, maybe a little towards Earth. And Yeah, I couldn't resist.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think this is something that we're gonna have lots more low Earth orbit constellations coming up, and
Yeah.
I think LEO is a good technology to have, in a quiver of many others when it comes to 5G.
I agree. And, it's, I've sort of spoken, to the digital divide on prior podcasts, and I'm working on my first book, The Human Network, where I'll be traveling around the world next year. Kind of got put on hold with the pandemic. But certainly, satellite is going to be an element. When I recently spent time with John Stankey with AT&T, we spoke pretty candidly together about satellites role and all of that. And it's definitely going to be an element, maybe not the save all be all, but I think the other challenge with Starlink, and potentially they're doing this, is that there have, been reports of very inconsistent, download and upload speeds. And so to take a service that's been inconsistent from a performance standpoint, and then layer into that, some throttling, that might serve to stall new subscribership. But time will tell. But to your point, Leo will be an important sort of element in the overall, ability to bridge digital divide. But there are other elements there too. We've talked about fixed wireless access on a number of different occasions. But let me move to my third and final topic this week, and I want to talk about the NFL and how they're leaning into private cellular networking. And it's not about the fan experience. So you and I have talked in the past. Millimeter wave is, it's ideally suited for a venue. You've got to densify it, but it's going to provide, the right level of performance, given just the profile of the spectrum. And then I think I've spoken on prior podcasts as well about how CBRS is also entering into the venue arena. And that's interesting, given, the profile at 3.5 gigahertz. But what's interesting, this was an article I believe Mike Dano published this week on Light Reading. What the NFL is filing with the SEC is the ability to continue to use in stadium coach-to-coach communication systems that run in that CBRS spectrum band. And this isn't surprising. I mean, it's a logical use case. You and I had Dave Wright on one of our prior podcasts, and I think we went into a little bit of detail about where they're seeing deployments in venues. But then you're also going to see, for example, the millimeter wave deployments, like the $120 million investment that Verizon made to outfit SoFi Stadium and the Hollywood Park area with 5G network equipment. And that was to support the Super Bowl this year. So it's interesting to see kind of the amalgam of, both mid-band and millimeter wave deployment in stadiums. But I don't know if you caught this article from Mike, but any additional insights you want to add?
I did not catch it, but I do think it's interesting. It's interesting because we're seeing more and more stadiums starting to really leverage private 5G networking.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure this is a 5G deployment, but it sounds like it might be 4G at this point. And maybe
It's it's LTE with a path to get to 5G, and it's probably a VoNR, voice over NR.
and that would be extremely high quality, right? So
Right.
I think it's going to be interesting to see how this evolves. I've been watching all of the wireless innovations that are happening in the sports space, right? Like, we when we were at the T-Mobile event, they talked about the MLB,
Yeah.
and they were also talking about using 5G for Red Bull and working really closely with them on that. So it seems like PitchCom is a thing now for baseball. So
Yeah.
it really seems like wireless technologies are starting to get embraced within different sports leagues. And, I think it totally makes sense for, the different coaches and their quarterbacks to be able to communicate with each other clearly.
Yeah.
Obviously there's a lot of, voice and interference issues and
Yeah.
noise that can interfere with the communications. But as long as the link itself is strong, I think that's really valuable. And there's so much interference in these stadiums already that
Yeah.
having a solid spectrum that you can rely on that's dedicated to this use case, I think is a great thing. And hopefully it results in better communications from the coaches, maybe even the refs being able to communicate with each other better, because we
Yeah.
don't even know what's going on there. But yeah, it sounds like an overall positive experience.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, I was going to say something funny about the Big 12 referee crews and how terrible they are this year. I don't think that's based on a lack of communication. I think they all need new prescription glasses. But I'm glad that you pointed out, the issues with interference. So yeah, so you have huge contention, RF contention, because a lot of these new stadiums are basically Faraday cages, and then the Wi-Fi is suspect as well because it becomes oversubscribed, really, really quickly. It's
Instantaneously.
yeah, and so you need a dedicated communication channel, for the coaches to actually do their job, in these professional sports, and even I would even argue even at the collegiate level as well. So it's yeah, it's another cool use case and demonstration for what's basically mid-band spectrum deployment in venues. But let's move to your third and final topic, and you want to talk about FCC and some rulings around C-band.
We're talking about C-band again.
Yeah,
with
we are.
aviation.
Here we go.
And the acting FAA administrator, Billy Nolan, says that the agency wants the FCC to mandate voluntary mitigations that AT&T and Verizon agreed to earlier this year and mandated for 19 other smaller telecoms and other spectrum holders to do that as well. So this is the FAA asking the FCC to do this. Okay. So it's the FCC that would have to implement it, but the FAA wants them to do it.
Okay.
And they're saying that if they don't have the FCC mandate these mitigations, the FAA would be forced to take immediate steps to ensure the safety of the traveling public, raising the likelihood of flight disruptions across the United States. So we're basically back where we started.
I mean, at least they're talking, and they're not waiting until New Year's Eve to throw a Hail Mary at the operators. And
I'm losing my mind because he said that the aviation industry is aggressively retrofitting the current U.S. domestic international fleets that fly in the United States with these filters, but added that data indicates even retrofitting aircraft would be susceptible to interference if the report and order is not modified.
Yeah.
Resulting in renewed concerns about unsafe interference.
Yeah, so this is basically their request to make the temporary restrictions permanent, right?
Yeah. And this Reuters article says that it remains unclear if the 4-member FCC, which we still don't have a 5th member, because I'm not going to mention which party will not pass a 5th member. And if we have a 4-member panel, and it's split 2-2, nothing gets passed.
There's no tiebreaker, yeah.
And they're saying that they don't know if they can even have the authority to retroactively impose conditions on companies that purchase the spectrum at auction, and if they would even have the votes to make the changes. So,
yeah.
FAA has shrunk these zones around airports where Verizon and AT&T can't fully use towers.
Yeah.
But Verizon said that the June agreement would allow it to lift the voluntary limitations on their 5G network deployment around airports in a staged approach. So, I don't know. I'm kind of trying to understand why we haven't resolved this issue.
Yeah.
Because the NTIA, FAA, and FCC still need to figure these things out. But this feels somewhat political, again, and it feels like the FAA is kind of acting on its own.
Mm-hmm.
And I struggle with it because they still haven't provided any real data that proves that there is interference, or even said that they're doing active testing to verify that this is a necessary mitigation.
Yeah. It's definitely affecting the performance on my AT&T device when I fly through DFW Airport, because that's apparently one of the exclusion zones. And my service is actually at times it's dropped below LTE performance. So they need to get their act together and figure this out. It's what's the definition of insanity? Repeating the same thing, expecting a different outcome. But I was a little encouraged. I shared some insights on our last podcast about the 5G Americas analyst event that you and I attended. And there was a gentleman, general counsel from the FCC. We're hoping to have him on a future podcast. So Anshel and I are still working on that. But he provided some insight that there is greatly, dramatically improved cross cooperation between these different agencies, but we're sort of back to square one here. So
it feels like it.
We'll just have to wait and see what happens. But hey, buddy, it's been another great podcast. Why don't you take us home?
Absolutely. We hope our viewers and listeners found this week's topics interesting. If anyone would like to reach out to us to provide insights on a specific 5G topic for a future podcast, please reach out to us on social media. Will is at Whaletown Tech, and I'm at Anshel Sog. We hope you have a great weekend, and please tune in again